I still may never recover from having watched that Oval Office meeting with Vance saying, you must say thank you. You must say thank you was what the Stalinist secret police interrogators and the justices at the Stalinist show trials said to the victims from whom they had tortured false confessions. Well, you have to thank the party for meting out, for giving you your just punishment.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa just before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee in the American South since 2015. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Marci Shore, a professor and chair in intellectual history at the University of Toronto in Canada. She's the translator of Michał Głowiński's The Black Seasons, and the author of Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968. The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. Marci, welcome to Rhyming Chaos.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation.
So let me start by asking about the fact that you've been in the news recently for a few reasons. You moved to Toronto with your husband, Timothy Snyder, and you've both been people who've been prominent commentators on what is going on in the United States right now and how to deal with it. Can you tell me why you moved to Toronto?
Yes. First of all, I should say that I really don't deserve to be such a big figure in the news right now, especially not for moving to Toronto, which was really a long in process, complex family decision, not directly related to the elections, but has somehow been blown up because of the coincidence in timing. The Monk School at University of Toronto had been recruiting me and my husband for the past 3 years. We had been contemplating these offers, and it's very likely we would have accepted them even if Kamala Harris had won. I definitely felt after the elections that I, under no circumstances, wanted to bring my kids back to the States. But my husband felt very differently. If he had been alone, he would have gone back, not despite the elections, but because of the elections, to fight for American democracy in America. I'm the neurotic Jew in the family. I'm the one who has always absorbed the fact that the lesson of 1933 is it's better to get out sooner rather than later.
Yes, it always is. You've spent a couple of decades writing about the history of authoritarianism in Eastern and Central Europe. What do you see here in the United States that resonates with your research on Central and Eastern Europe?
A lot, unfortunately. Perhaps let me back up and say that the story about our moving to Toronto and our friend and colleague Jason Stanley, who really did make his decision for political reasons at the last minute, also coming to Toronto, a philosopher, blew up into this international story. And so I was talking to all of these European journalists, and they kept asking me questions like, but this can't really be happening in America. This isn't really happening in America. I mean, don't you think that, perhaps the Trump administration is really trying to protect Jewish students from anti-Semitism? And I felt like, do you really need this banal story of a handful of middle-aged academics moving from one good university to another good university, which is the most ordinary occurrence, to shake you into seeing what is actually happening in America? Europeans precisely having had their own experiences, of fascism, of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism in the 20th century, they shouldn't need any kind of pretext to be shaken into seeing what is right in front of their eyes. But for some reason, there's a tremendous amount of denial. And doing these interviews, I felt like I was playing the role of psychoanalyst, just trying to coax people out of this Freudian denial of seeing what was right there, which they are and should be in some ways familiar with, but somehow couldn't quite believe could really be happening in America. This myth of American exceptionalism that seems to have spread throughout the world, that, democracy, liberalism, of course, can fall apart in other places. but not in America. We are the land of the free and the home of the brave. We drink in our liberalism with our mother's milk. We have checks and balances. In some ways, none of those things make any sense because it can fall apart anywhere. I kept using this analogy that I felt like we were people on the Titanic saying, our ship can't sink. We've got the best ship, the biggest ship, the strongest ship. Our ship can't sink. But there is just no such thing as a ship that can't sink. There is no such creature. Any ship can sink. But there's been a real failure to recognize that, I think, internationally. I think Americans perhaps have a different problem. I mean, there was a sense in 2016, okay, like let's inhale, checks and balances, exhale, checks and balances, that somehow the system was going to hold up and protect us. But there's also the fact that Americans have normalized the abnormal over a long period of time. And there's a level of violence and racism in the United States that has always been there, that has contributed to a kind of background that I think has allowed this to take hold. But let me back up. You asked me what I saw as a historian of Eastern Europe. A whole lot of things, and I would actually go all the way back to 2008. And I know when I say this to students these days, it's too far back for them to remember, which makes me feel very old. But when John McCain chose Sarah Palin as his running mate, that to me was eerily reminiscent of what you saw in the 90s in places like Hungary and Romania. You have an old conservative right that represents a kind of continuity, stability, xenophobia, tradition, order that makes an alliance with the new fascist right, not quite understanding that the new fascist right is not just a more energetic, invigorated version of themselves. This was Antonescu, and the Iron Guard. This was Horthy and the Arrow Cross. And it takes the old right a little bit of time to figure out that they were mistaken, and then they get scared. And I felt like I saw that happening with John McCain and Sarah Palin, that he had unleashed something he did not intend to unleash and profoundly did not understand and got scared at a certain point. And when they lost the election, I had a moment of thinking stupidly and naively like, okay, that was terrifying, but that danger, has at least for the moment passed.
So that was the birth of the Tea Party, really, and in America, people just allowed that to happen.
Yes. And I feel like that was the beginning. I would trace that continuity from Sarah Palin through the Tea Party to Donald Trump. I've always been a person on the left. I would not have voted for John McCain in any case, but he was not a lunatic. Sarah Palin, you could tell she lived in a totally fictitious world in which anything was possible and there was no sense of constraint. She would happily incite a mob to lynch someone. Once that force was unleashed, it felt like it was hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And there are a lot of cracks to exploit in America. The Europeans who keep telling me, but this couldn't possibly happen in America. Okay, it happened to us. I said, remember, we are a country that was built on slavery. We sent racially segregated troops to fight the Nazis in the Second World War. We had miscegenation laws criminalizing interracial marriage until 1967. We had anti-sodomy laws criminalizing homosexual activity until 2003. So this idea that, America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and that's somehow hardwired, and it cannot be mutated, doesn't actually align with the empirical facts of American history.
But in terms of the current moment, do you think Sarah Palin was the moment that we really started to go off the rails here in the US?
Felt like something had come onto the political mainstream stage. Not that had not been there on the mainstream stage before, which isn't to say it hadn't been there. All sorts of things are there. But the fact that she gets a hair's breadth from the presidency, somebody whose claim to foreign policy is, I can see Alaska from my backyard, that was terrifying. And somebody who really deeply had no sense of restraint, who was willing to play with violence. John McCain didn't like violence. There is a famous moment, I think in some ways the key moment in that campaign that I don't know how many people remember it, but there was a rally, and there was a rally that could easily turn into a mob, and somebody starts shouting, that Obama was dangerous and Obama was a Muslim and Obama was an Arab. And John McCain got scared. And you could feel him get scared. And he said, no, ma'am, that's not true. He's a Christian. He's a good man. Now, this, of course, was the wrong answer because you've already accepted the basis of the claim that being a Muslim or being an Arab is bad. But John McCain's impulse was, he's a decent man. He's a family man. He happens to be somebody I disagree with about a lot of policy things, but, he's a perfectly fine person. And you could feel that John McCain was afraid. He was afraid of the crowd he had unleashed. And this coming onto the political stage of a kind of crowd that could turn into a violent mob, or the masses being led onto the stage by what Hannah Arendt would call the mob. This goes back at least to the Dreyfus trial. This was why both Theodor Herzl and Hannah Arendt were so obsessed with the moment of the Dreyfus trial, because they saw that as the moment when the previously politically unengaged masses do come onto the political stage, but not on the side of the liberals, as they were supposed to, according to, liberalism as it came out of Enlightenment philosophy, but drawn there by the mob.
Marci, can you explain the Dreyfus trial a little bit?
Sure. The Dreyfus trial, I'm now taking everybody back to turn of the century, late 19th century France, when a French military officer was unjustly and falsely accused of treason. And he was an assimilated Jewish guy. Yes, a very assimilated French Jew who very deeply identified as being a French military officer. But the fact that he was a Jew allowed him to be scapegoated for somebody else's traitorous activity. And what was terrifying about this to both Herzl and Arendt was seeing the masses of the French come out onto the streets and shout death to the Jews. For Theodor Herzl, this was the beginning of modern Zionism. For Theodor Herzl, this was the moment when you accept that Jewish emancipation has failed because liberalism has failed as such. Yeah. And that's what he's covering the trial for a Viennese paper. And this is what then prompts him to say, okay, I'm an assimilated Jew. Assimilation's failed. Emancipation's failed. Liberalism's failed. We need another solution. For Arendt, this was the moment when what she is going to call the mob comes out onto the political stage and leads the masses onto the political stage. And she uses the mob and the masses almost as a technical term here. And she says the mob is the dark underside of the bourgeoisie, its own kind of elite, the gangsters, whereas the masses are the previously politically indifferent, unengaged, and politically ignored majority. And the liberals had always been waiting for the masses to come out onto the political stage and expand the franchise, and act a deeper kind of democracy. The masses do come onto the political stage, but not on the side of the liberals. They are led there by the mob. And there's a famous passage in Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism where she describes Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera. And there's a line, Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral. First you devour, then later you talk about the ethics of it. And she says, everybody delighted in this. The mob because it took it literally, and the bourgeoisie because they had been grown tired of their own hypocrisy, and took a kind of secret delight in having the curtain pulled on their own performance.
So what lessons should we take from that in Trump's America?
Certainly that potential, the potential for people to come out on the political stage against some kind of a scapegoat is always present. I think there are certain things that are they're always present. It's a question of how they're managed. René Girard would say all culture is founded on sacrifice. All culture is founded on scapegoating. So the desire at any moment of instability, of crisis, of suffering to project lots of anxieties and fears onto a scapegoat is always going to be present. And of course, Trump is a master at this, as were the Nazis, as were the Stalinists. I mean, you could always find someone who needed to be purged. The 5-year plan isn't going so well. Well, that's because there are saboteurs and wreckers, and we're going to put them on show trial. There's always someone that the crowd can direct their own violence that is within them against some kind of a scapegoat. And Trump has just been a master of mobilizing that anger, and that resentment and directing it to a scapegoat. And he's not afraid of using violence, especially domestically.
Did you watch the events in Los Angeles?
I've caught some of the clip. I've seen fragments. I haven't watched any really long videos of it. I mean, my sense is that we're dealing with provocation, what in Russian you call provokatsiya, which is provocation with a little extra oomph, a kind of a setup in which you create a pretext for further violence and further repression. And that feels almost too obvious. And I feel like that's something that the Trump administration has played with quite a lot. That was also my fear. This is a long motif. This goes back even pre-Soviet into the Tsarist Empire. You have the authorities or the powers that be inciting violence to use that as an excuse for further repression and further violence. For instance, as soon as Mahmoud Khalil was unjustly arrested, taken away from his pregnant wife, thrown in prison in Louisiana, allegedly because the Trump administration was protecting Jews from anti-Semitism, I thought, this is a setup. This is a setup in which the justified anger of people of being unfairly targeted, and victimized on the pretext of protecting Jews can easily then be redirected against the Jews as the pretext for this kind of violence and oppression. And that violence could then be turned against the Jews, which the regime would love nothing more than to play with that kind of violence and turn it from one force against another force. And I see that in Los Angeles too. Okay, you have people protesting the violence that ICE is doing by these largely arbitrary deportations and this total breakdown of rule of law, of habeas corpus, of any kind of due process. And the protest against those violence can then be met with more violence, can then be used to provoke someone to commit some act of violence, or you can plant people in the midst of a demonstration to commit acts of violence. I mean, all you need are a couple people to throw a couple stones, and then you have a pretext for a large-scale crackdown.
Yeah. How should Jews react to this moment, do you think? And I ask as someone who has, my kids go to a Jewish day school, and quite a lot of people we know are very pro-Israel, and they are supportive of the Trump administration. And I'm finding it very difficult to talk to them about these things because I think, as you say, the Trump administration is using, the pretext of fighting against anti-Semitism. We're being used as tools right now.
I think that's true. And I think it's our job not to let that happen. I've rarely publicly engaged explicitly as a Jew. And I did, in this case, I signed an open letter. I think the title was Not in Our Name, protesting the detention of Mahmoud Khalil, on the logic that it was not about, did I agree with what he was saying? Did I not agree with what he was saying? It was about the fact that if Jews allow ourselves to be used as a pretext for abusing the rights of other people, we have morally bankrupted ourselves. And that is not permissible. That's under no circumstances permissible, regardless of where one comes out on this, grotesque, disastrous war in Gaza and this grotesque, disastrous attack on October 7th, regardless of one's position there. Jews cannot allow ourselves to be used as a pretext for abusing the rights of other people in our own country. It's horrific.
So what should Americans do right now to ensure that this country doesn't completely descend into an authoritarian nightmare?
I wish I had a magical solution to that. And I feel like I have all the less right to give anybody else advice. I'm considering that I'm not in the States right now. The thing I would say, again, as a historian, looking back at moments that I know well as a historian, like Solidarity in Poland, like the revolution on the Maidan in Ukraine, all kinds of tyrannical regimes use methods to atomize a given population. You plant spies. You create a situation in which everyone is suspicious of everybody else. You break down social trust. Stalinism was, a kind of masterful situation of having everybody spying on everybody else. And I'm now reminding everyone, if you have not read Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs, Hope Against Hope, she's incredibly articulate and perspicacious on this point. What happens when anyone can denounce anyone at any moment and everybody is watching everyone else? You atomize a society. You isolate people. You make everybody fearful all the time. And the fact that there's a lot of arbitrariness in terms of who is going to be targeted. This is a Russian word I keep using, proizvol, which means arbitrariness kind of always already tinged with tyranny and the potential for terror. The very fact of things being arbitrary scares people because there's no safe space. You don't really know what side of a line it's safe to stand on. You don't know who's going to be next. And so everybody keeps their head down. Everybody retreats. The only real examples I can think of in which that is overcome in great dramatic moments is through solidarity. The only antidote to that kind of atomization is solidarity. And it really involves lots of people, uniting, even with people they don't perfectly agree with, and standing up for one another. And so that famous quote by the German pastor, who was an anti-Semitic sympathizer turned Nazi political prisoner, first they came for the trade unionist and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the socialist, I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Jews, I didn't speak up. And then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. It is really important that people speak up for one another. That kind of solidarity is really important. My colleagues, Jeff Goldfarb at the New School and Jeff Isaac at Indiana University, we've put together a new website called Small Acts of Democratic Resistance, which is a platform just documenting what are like local, or acts of resistance or refusal to compromise that might not rise to the level of the international media, as a platform for recognition and solidarity, as well as a resource for foreign journalists. So if your listeners know of examples, please, they should look up Small Acts of Resistance Democracy Seminar and send them to the Democracy Seminar address, because it's important that people know there are other people out there and they're not alone. And I think that's especially important in places that are not New York or Los Angeles, in places where there is a lot more support for Trump, in places that are much more rural, where you don't have the same kinds of support structures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can we just go back to Los Angeles a little bit and tell me a little bit more? I mean, I know you say you haven't followed it closely.
I've been following them, but not intensely closely. I mean, I've seen some fragments of the coverage. I've seen the ways in which the mayor and the governor have resisted. I thought the governor gave a great, and very categorical interview about Trump's being a liar and refusing to somehow sugarcoat that situation or make it seem like, well, it was just a kind of misunderstanding. The fact that you call out the military on your own people, I mean, this strikes me as the first step towards martial law.
Yeah, it's very scary.
I mean, we can think about moments. My older retired diplomat friend, Tom Simons, was watching what was going on in Los Angeles, and he emailed, last night, and he said, I'm thinking of the Reichstag fire. I'm thinking of Kirov's assassination, in the Soviet Union. You create a pretext for what's going to be a major turn. That's my historian's intuition, too, that, we've been waiting for that Reichstag fire moment.
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
That's my intuition. I mean, historians can only really tell you what's already happened. We can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. But that's definitely my intuition. I think we've been moving towards that for a long time. I think the second Trump administration is much scarier than the first, and I was terrified during the first. I think that the cult of the leader that you get in all sorts of fascist and authoritarian movements is much more in your face and over the top. I mean, you remember that moment when in March, when J.D. Vance was talking about Greenland, saying, we can't ignore the president's desires, in this case, to acquire Greenland. And I'll parenthetically say that the demand to honor the president's desire for Greenland was greeted enthusiastically, I suspect precisely by that same demographic of Americans who 6 months earlier had no idea that there was such a place as Greenland and suddenly are ready to invade it. But the idea we cannot ignore the president's desires and the president, his desires, and he is this godlike figure. He's a champion golfer. His public relations person was calling him a musical virtuoso whose, quote, musical choices represent a brilliant, palette of vibrant colors when others often paint in pale pastels. I mean, go back and look at how Ceausescu was described in Romania in the 1980s, and you'll see very similar phrases. Oh, the genius of the Carpathians, the hero of heroes, the Danube of thought. I mean, this kind of Nero-like narcissism, you can see it in Henryk Sienkiewicz's epic retelling of the Nero story. It's so over the top, and yet it's all playing out for real in front of us.
So I'm going to repeat a question. As a new American, I became a citizen about 5 years ago. I was quite glad to become a citizen, from South Africa and lived in China for much of my life. So in authoritarian countries, and I first arrived when Obama was still president, and it seemed amazing. So to repeat my question, what should I do if I want to stop this stuff?
It's a really good question. I mean, the only thing I can think of is that we can't fall silent. We have to keep talking, and we have to keep expressing solidarity with other people, and we can't put our heads down and make it okay. I mean, one of the most perceptive moments after the 2016 elections, which was largely ignored, was the British political comedian John Oliver. He said, everybody take out a Post-it note and write on that Post-it note, this is not normal, and stick it on your refrigerator, because you're going to start to normalize. The thing that you thought was completely unimaginable, 3 months later is going to be the new normal you will not have noticed. And I thought his Post-it note idea, which was seemingly funny, was actually deadly serious and very perceptive, because the thing you see again and again throughout history is the extraordinary capacity of human beings to normalize the abnormal. And so things that just seemed you could never even think about them, people then take them in and say, okay, well, now we're used to this. We have to not be used to it. We have to continue to allow ourselves to see what's going on and be shocked. Trump's whole strategy is like, you don't conceal the outrageousness. It's all laid bare. It's all in your face all the time, every day. And there's one crazy thing after another, and you get used to it. We all get used to it. The kind of the vulgar language that he brought onto the mainstream political stage, beginning with the competitive allusions to penis size during the first Republican primary debates, that kind of violence and vulgarity and racism and misogyny, it gradually becomes normalized. And we get used to things we didn't think we'd get used to. Then 2020 came. There was January 6th. We were a hair's breadth from a fascist coup. Americans, I think, repressed that memory because in some ways it was so traumatic. And then things seemed to calm down. And there was a sense of like when Biden was elected, when he was inaugurated, European politicians were saying, okay, welcome back, America. All right, like that was scary, but now it's over and now we're going to move forward. As recently as, 3 years ago after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, just something I've been very involved in what's happening in Ukraine. I just got back from Kiev a few days ago, and I was giving a briefing to a Democratic congresswoman and her Washington staff about Russia and Ukraine, trying to help them understand what was going on. And these were all very smart people. They weren't regional experts. And the world is big. You can't possibly know about every place. I don't know about most places very much. And so I was trying to go walk them through different ways of understanding this. And they knew that, okay, this had been one country. It was the Soviet Union. It broke up in 1991. People spoke Russian in Ukraine. They spoke Russian in Russia. There were lots of families on both sides of the border. What was the difference? What was going on? Who really belonged to what? And I spontaneously at the time, I tried to explain from one angle, from another angle, and I spontaneously pulled out this analogy. I said, listen, imagine January 6th had gone the other way. And imagine we were now living in a Trumpist dictatorship. And under the guise of making America great again, Trump decides to send the American army to invade Canada, and start shelling Toronto and burying kids under rubble. Canada's a bilingual country, but really everyone also speaks English. They eat hamburgers and French fries, and we eat hamburgers and French fries, so really, what's the difference? Why would anybody mind? And I was trying, of course, to make the point that no linguistic or cultural affinity possibly made an invasion and the carrying out of mass atrocity any less outrageous. And this analogy was so effective at that time, precisely because nobody in that room could conceive of a scenario in which the American government would ever contemplate invading Canada. And now look where we are. Oh, it should be the 51st state.
Yeah, it really is truly remarkable. And not just Canada.
Yes. Now suddenly what was completely unthinkable has just been put on the table.
And it is thinkable now.
Right.
Let's talk about Ukraine. Why did you go there on this most recent trip?
We should think about Ukraine as our hope, and what will be, hopefully, if the world does not come to an end, the new avant-garde of pointing to some better future. This was my fourth trip since the full-scale invasion, and I have not been to the front. I am not a particularly brave person at all. I was in Kiev. I was there because I was guest curating together with the wonderful writer and editor Oksana Forostina, the Kiev Book Arsenal, which is the largest literary festival there. They have a guest curator every year with a different theme. We chose the theme, Everything is Translation. And it had been in preparation for most of a year, since August. And it was huge. Thousands of people came in the midst of a war, which was quite remarkable. And the mood was actually very, very good, despite the fact that, panels and lectures and conversations were getting interrupted by air raid sirens. Then you had to descend into a bomb shelter, which everybody is used to. A lot of Ukrainians no longer go to the bomb shelter because they've just decided to take their chances because your life gets interrupted so often. But I can now check off, signed copies of my book in a bomb shelter from my bucket list, during an air raid. But the mood was still quite good. I think they see the world in some sense much more clearly in general, certainly than the Americans do. They know what they're dealing with. It's a grotesque invasion. It's a grotesque war. There's an element of pure nihilism to what Russia is doing. There was a moment when I was there last year where just in a 3-hour period, just one morning, Russia sent 31 missiles just to Kiev, during which time I was in a bomb shelter because, I'm a neurotic American and I was not taking my chances. And after I got out of the bomb shelter, I was asking a European diplomat I knew who was checking on me. I said, just out of curiosity, how much did those 31 missiles cost? That was $390 million worth of missiles that the Russians spent just that one morning, just to kill and destroy. Russia is a country where millions of people are too impoverished to have indoor plumbing. Putin is just burning through the country's resources and bleeding through his population and carrying out grotesque acts of mass atrocity, and grotesque practices of torture. It's gruesome, and know people personally who have been in Russian captivity, who have been tied to boards, who have been electrocuted. And for what?
Yeah.
The Russian soldiers don't even know why they're there. And that will keep going until that regime is brought down. I think that what the Ukrainians understand very, very well is that we're not dealing with a rational actor. But there is nothing rational about what Putin is carrying out unless you expand the definition of rationality to the point where it's effectively meaningless. You have masses of Russian soldiers carrying out atrocities for no good reason.
So how does this compare to the United States right now? Of course, we're not quite there yet.
It's not exactly the same, but what we do have, the thing that I keep thinking of in more of a kind of philosophical, larger scale sense, is that the number of people who are actually, hardcore psychopaths, lunatics, moral nihilists, people for whom other people's lives mean absolutely nothing. People like Trump, people like Putin, people like Lukashenko for that matter. I think it's a very marginal demographic. I think people who actually are total lack of empathy for other human beings and or an addiction to sadism, I think that's a marginal demographic. So the question is, what is the law of negative selection by which such people are grossly overrepresented in positions of power? And that seems to be true on both sides of the Atlantic.
What you're asking is, why are these crazy people in charge?
The Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski used the phrase negative selection, negatywna selekcja. What is the law of negative selection? If you just stood on the street and closed your eyes and randomly pointed at strangers and put them in government, you would do better than these people we have now. You would do better than Trump and Vance and Elon Musk. These are really people who just have no respect for the lives of other human beings. I still may never recover from having watched that Oval Office meeting with Vance saying, you must say thank you. You must say thank you was what the Stalinist secret police interrogators and the justices at the Stalinist show trials said to the victims from whom they had tortured false confessions. Well, you have to thank the party for meting out, for giving you your just punishment. There was this extraordinary Czech film made in the late 1960s as an allegory of the Stalinist purges based on the witchcraft trials in late 17th century Bohemia called Kladivo na čarodějnice, kind of hammer on the witches. And at the end of this quite vile film, which these very graphic scenes of how they tortured false confessions from these women of how they, were in the service of the devil and carried out witchcraft, they're being led to the stake to be burned alive. And the last thing you hear is these authorities on the tribunal saying to these women who are about to be burned alive, "Tita poděkovat," you must say thank you. And that's the first thing that came into my mind when Van says there, you must say thank you, you must say thank you. And this ritual humiliation. And it was so disgusting. It's like these two despicable people, who were saying this to a man who actually felt responsibility for the lives of millions of people. Trump is someone who has never taken responsibility for anything.
This is grim, but also cathartic for me to hear you discuss it in this way.
Sorry, that wasn't very cheerful, but yeah.
I mean, we're not living in cheerful times. It's not easy to be happy about stuff right now. And this podcast isn't really designed to necessarily cheer people up.
I met Volodymyr Zelensky and his wife, Elena Zelenskaya, last week at this book festival in Kiev. And I had to restrain myself from not hysterically apologizing for the way that he was treated in Washington, which I just felt such shame and disgust about. But that moment when Trump said, "You're not holding any cards," and Zelensky said, "We're not playing cards," that was actually a very profound moment because for somebody like Trump, all relationships are purely transactional. There is nothing else. It's all a game. There's nothing besides prostitution in that sense. There's nothing besides everybody buying and selling themselves. Zelensky, you can criticize him and you can like this decision or not like that decision, but he is a man who feels profoundly responsible for the lives of these millions of people in Ukraine.
Wow. I'm sorry. This is, I think, the third time I've asked you, but what I am finding very difficult in my life right now is how should I behave as a human being? I mean, should we be on the streets? I mean, I think you've said we shouldn't be silent, but should I be making more podcasts? What the fuck should I do in order to help, in order to stop?
Yeah, now I ask myself that all the time. And again, I feel like I have no right to speak because I'm in Toronto, but I would say all of those things. I would say we have to protect the people who are most vulnerable. First and foremost, I think that's really important. The thing that's haunted me since the inauguration, and I've been back and forth to New Haven several times since January, meeting, among other things, with my students and graduate students, my advisees at Yale. And many of them are foreigners. I mean, as you know, there are huge percentages of foreigners at all of these universities. The universities would not function as the kind of elite educational centers they are without that cosmopolitan mixture. And in my field, in East European history, there's probably an even higher percentage of foreigners. So I would say probably almost half of my students are foreigners. And I now ask myself all the time, okay, I'm sitting at a coffee shop. We're talking about, a student's thesis. We're talking about a research project. What do I do if guys in balaclavas come to take her away? What do I do then? Am I going to be brave? Am I going to fight with them? Am I going to try to pull the mask off? Am I going to scream? Or would I get scared and run away? Or would I start crying? I don't know. And I don't necessarily trust myself at all to be brave. But I do feel like it is really important that we look out for people who are vulnerable. It's really important in a situation like that other people don't put their heads down and look away, that we try to protect one another. I think we have to try to fill up that public space with truth-telling. I mean, this is also a particular problem of our post-truth era. Back in Soviet times and in communist times, the dissidents really believed that if you could just get the truth out there amidst all these lies, that would be the thing that would liberate people. Now the problem is less that the truth is repressed and more that it's drowned out by all of this other garbage. I mean, the idea of troll factories where you can invent one story after another and throw it against the wall to see what sticks like digital spaghetti. This was inconceivable in, say, 1985. But because we're up against that, I think in some ways the mandate to keep insisting on creating a public space again and again and again where there's a commitment to truth, where there's a commitment to empirical reality, I think a lot of the problem the opposition has had is that we kept trying to find the thing that was hidden, thinking that would unravel the tyranny, as opposed to just describing what is right in front of us. Because the whole strategy in this post-truth era is just to lay everything bare. This was also the strategy of Putin's spin doctor. So this was Surkov's idea. You don't hide it, you put it right there on the surface. So listen, we're more honest. All of the vulgar, despicable things we're doing are right there. And when Americans find themselves attracted to Trump's honesty, it's obviously honesty not in the sense of correspondence between what he says and empirical reality, but all of that ugliness, all of the misogyny and the sexism and the xenophobia and the violence, it's vulgarity, it's all right there. All of the corruption, it's all right there. It's not even vaguely hidden. And since it's so obvious, it's almost as if it disempowers us and we don't know what to do with it. And I think one thing I think it's important to do is just to make sure we keep actually seeing what's in front of us and not think that if it's too obvious, it must not be the thing we're really supposed to see, or it must not be the key thing, or we've already gotten used to it, so we're habituated, so we're not really seeing it anymore. I think we have to keep being like, this is what we're seeing in front of us, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to describe it, and we're going to make it vivid, and we're going to make sure people really see what is in front of them. It's very hard to see this thing that's obvious. It's really hard to pay attention to it.
Well, on that note, Marci Shore, thank you very much for coming on the Rhyming Chaos podcast, which is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and Maria Repnikova. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the Guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Shimno Petty No. 1, also performed and arranged by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you so much, Marci. That was a fascinating chat.
You're very welcome. Good luck to you. Good luck to all of us.